Have you ever noticed how a single place, a quiet corner, a dusty room, the shade of an old tree, can hold an entire lifetime within its walls? They say home is where the heart is, but sometimes our stories are written in the places we fight to keep. Welcome to Loving Truth Stories. We're a small corner of the internet dedicated to tales like that, stories about the threads of fate, the echoes of the past, and the second chances we never see coming. If you believe that a good story can feel like coming home, and you don't want to miss where this journey takes us, consider becoming a part of our community. Just a simple click on the subscribe button ensures that you'll always have a new chapter waiting for you. And tonight, we begin a brand new story. One I believe will stay with you for a long time. It's called Where Love Begins Again. Our story begins in the small town of Havenwood, a place tucked away in the mountains, so quiet you could almost hear the seasons change. And at the heart of Havenwood's sleepy Main Street stood a little shop called the Cozy Corner. It wasn't just a bookstore. It was a sanctuary built of paper and ink. The air inside always smelled of aging vanilla and leather-bound promises. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the large front window, illuminating towers of books that leaned like old friends supporting one another. This was Nora's world, and for her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, it was the whole universe. Nora moved through the aisles with a quiet grace, her fingers tracing the spines of books she knew by heart. She was a woman whose smile didn't always reach her eyes, but when she looked at Lily, curled up in the worn-out armchair in the children's section, her entire face would light up. Lily, with her bright, curious eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years, was the sun that Nora's world revolved around. But even in the coziest corners, the chill of the outside world can find a way in. Lately, a nervous energy had settled over Havenwood. It was a low hum of gossip in the diner, worried whispers over picket fences. "Mommy," Lily's small voice piped up from behind a large picture book. "Why is everyone buzzing like angry bees?" Nora forced a gentle smile, straightening a stack of novels. "They're just worried about some changes, sweet pea, that's all." The changes had a name. Apex Development, a massive corporation from the city with plans as big as their bank account. They saw Havenwood not as a home, but as a blank canvas for a luxury mountain resort. They had made offers, generous ones, some said to every business owner on Main Street. One by one, the for sale signs had gone up in the windows of the bakery, the hardware store, the old movie theater. Everyone had sold, everyone except the Cozy Corner. Later that afternoon, old Mr. Henderson, the retired mailman, shuffled in, his face etched with worry. "Nora," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "I heard they gave you a final offer, a life-changing amount of money, they're saying." Nora continued stamping a receipt, her movement steady, betraying none of the tremor in her heart. "This place is my life, Bill. It was my parents' life before me. Some things don't have a price tag. But you're the last one," he pressed gently. "The very last one holding out." She looked up, and for a moment, he saw the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. Behind the counter, tucked away, was a stack of unpaid bills. The new roof she'd dreamed of, the flickering overhead light that needed fixing, it all required money she didn't have. But selling felt like giving up on more than just a building. It felt like breaking a promise to the past, and to the little girl who thought this magical place would last forever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty street, Nora locked the front door. Lily was asleep in the back room, curled up on a small cot. Nora stood alone in the silence of her store, her reflection a faint ghost in the window. Outside, Main Street looked different, haunted by the ghosts of what it once was. She was the last bookstore, the last holdout, a final, quiet chapter in a story that a corporate giant was determined to erase. And she had no idea that the man sent to write her ending was a ghost from a life she'd long since buried. Miles away, in a city that never slept, that ghost was staring out at a kingdom of glittering lights. Some men build walls of brick and stone. Caleb Vance had built his of glass and steel. His office, on the 57th floor of the Vance Tower, wasn't a room so much as a space suspended between the earth and the stars. The only sound was the silent hum of technology and the soft clink of ice against crystal as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He wasn't looking at the city. His eyes were fixed on the holographic model shimmering in the center of the room, the Apex Summit Resort at Havenwood. A masterpiece of modern architecture designed to rise from the ashes of a town he'd spent the last decade trying to forget. Caleb was the architect of his own life, a man sculpted from ambition and sheer force of will. His suits were tailored armor, his smile a calculated asset, and his heart a fortress few were ever granted entry to. He had built Apex Development from nothing, precisely to erase the memory of the boy he used to be, a boy from a forgotten town with dirt under his fingernails and holes in his shoes. His private line buzzed, a soft, insistent chime. Only one person used that line. "Sterling," Caleb answered, his voice low and steady. "Caleb," the older man's voice crackled through the speaker, as smooth and aged as the whiskey in Caleb's glass. "The board is getting nervous. The Havenwood project is stalled. What's the holdup?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He swiped a hand through the hologram, zooming in on a single defiant red dot on the map of Main Street. "One holdout, a small bookstore, the owner is refusing to sell." There was a pause on the other end. "A bookstore," Sterling repeated, a note of amusement in his tone. "And Apex Development, the titan of industry, is being held hostage by a little old lady with a library card." "It's being handled," Caleb said, the words clipped. "My legal team has made a final offer that exceeds market value by 200%. It's illogical for her to refuse." "Logic has very little to do with a person's home, my boy," Sterling sighed. "This isn't just another skyscraper in Dubai. This project is your legacy, the crown jewel. It needs a personal touch, your personal touch. The board thinks you should go yourself, close the deal, show them the face of the future." The glass in Caleb's hand grew cold. Go back to Havenwood. The name itself felt like ash in his mouth. It was the place where the roads were cracked, where dreams went to die, where every corner held a memory he had fought to exorcise. It was the place he had run from without ever looking back. "Send Michelson," Caleb countered. "He's our best negotiator." "Michelson negotiates contracts, Caleb. This requires negotiating with a memory. A past. It has to be you," Sterling said, his voice firm now, leaving no room for argument. "Whatever ghosts you left in those mountains, it's time you faced them. Your future depends on it." The line went dead. Caleb stood there for a long time, the city lights blurring into a meaningless tapestry below. He had conquered boardrooms, crushed competitors, and built an empire from sheer nerve. Yet, the thought of returning to that sleepy, insignificant town filled him with a dread he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just flying back to a project, he was flying back to a feeling. The feeling of being the boy who had nothing, who promised a girl the world and then ran away to build it for himself alone. With a final, resigned sigh, he tapped on his tablet, the screen illuminating his cold, unreadable expression. He booked a flight for one. Destination, the one place on Earth he never wanted to see again. 2 days later, a sleek black sedan, silent as a panther, glided down Havenwood's Main Street. It was an alien craft in a land of trusted old pickup trucks and dusty station wagons. Behind the tinted glass, Caleb watched the town of his youth scroll by like a film from another lifetime. A town doesn't forget, even if a man does. The old oak tree in the square still stood, its branches heavy with memories he'd tried to shed. The welcome sign still had the same peeling paint. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because now he was the one looking down. He told himself this was just a business transaction, an acquisition. The past was irrelevant, but with every familiar storefront, a splinter of a memory lodged itself under his skin. He saw the corner where he'd had his first kiss, the alley behind the diner where he'd gotten into his only fist fight. Ghosts. He was here to exorcise them once and for all by tearing them down and building something new, something powerful in their place. Heads turned as his car purred to a stop. The few people on the sidewalk paused, their faces a mixture of awe and suspicion. They knew that car didn't belong. They knew it represented the coming storm. Caleb ignored them, his gaze fixed on his objective across the street, a small, defiant building with a faded green awning. The Cozy Corner. The name was a bitter irony. There was nothing cozy about this problem. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the single red mark on his otherwise perfect blueprint. From his detached, air-conditioned world, he assessed it. Old brickwork, large window display filled with a chaotic but colorful array of books. Structurally insignificant. Emotionally, he refused to let that word enter the equation. As he watched, the small bell above the door chimed, a sound too faint for him to hear but one he could imagine. A woman stepped out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun was bright, and from this distance, she was just a silhouette. A figure with long, flowing hair tied back loosely, wearing a simple apron. She knelt to adjust a chalkboard sign that read, "A book is a dream you hold in your hands." Caleb scoffed under his breath. Sentimental nonsense. Then, a flash of movement. A little girl, no older than 7, with a wild mane of honey blonde hair, burst out of the door and threw her arms around the woman's legs. The woman laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that seemed to momentarily cut through the hum of his engine. She ruffled the child's hair, their two forms melting into a single, intimate moment of pure affection. For a split second, something inside Caleb's chest tightened. A strange, unfamiliar ache. It was a scene of a life so fundamentally different from his own, a life of small, sunlit moments that couldn't be quantified or acquired. He saw a mother and a daughter, nothing more. The woman was a nameless, faceless obstacle, the child an irrelevant detail. He couldn't see the familiar line of the woman's jaw, or the way the little girl's eyes, even from across the street, held a spark he should have recognized as his own. He had buried that part of his life so deep, he no longer knew what its ghost looked like. He pushed the fleeting feeling aside, replacing it with the cold resolve that had made him a millionaire. This was the target. This was the problem he was here to solve. He took a steadying breath, the kind a man takes before a battle, and opened the car door. The quiet of Havenwood was immediately broken by the solid, expensive thud as it closed behind him. He smoothed the front of his $1,000 suit, a piece of armor for a battle he was certain he would win. Each step he took across the cracked pavement of Main Street felt deliberate, powerful. He was no longer the boy who had to run from this place. He was the king returning to claim his territory. He ignored the curtain twitching in the window of the diner, the whispers that followed him like a shadow. His focus was singular, the little bookstore with the green awning. He reached the door, pausing for a fraction of a second to read the handwritten sign on the glass, closed for lunch, back at 2. His watch read 2:05. With a cool sense of purpose, he pushed the door open. The bell chimed. It was a small, simple sound, a cheerful little tinkle, but it struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact same bell from his memories. A sound he hadn't heard in 8 years, yet his soul recognized it instantly. The scent of the store rushed in to meet him next. Vanilla old paper, a hint of cinnamon from a forgotten cup of tea. It was the scent of a life he had surgically removed from his memory. His well-rehearsed opening speech died on his lips. Behind the counter, a woman was standing on a small stepladder, her back to him, carefully placing a book onto a high shelf. He saw the gentle curve of her back, the loose strands of brown hair escaping from a messy bun. He cleared his throat, a sound that felt foreign and harsh in the gentle silence of the room. "Excuse me," he began, his voice the clipped, authoritative tone of a CEO. "I'm here to speak with the owner." She didn't turn around immediately. "I'll be right with you," she said, her voice warm and a little tired but familiar, so achingly familiar it made his heart stop. And then she turned. Time is a funny thing. It can pass in the blink of an eye, or it can stretch a single, silent moment into an eternity. As she stepped down from the ladder and her eyes met his, 8 years vanished. For Nora, the world simply ceased to exist. The man standing before her wore the face of a stranger, chiseled, hardened by success, cloaked in expensive fabric. But his eyes, they were the same deep, stormy gray eyes of the boy who had promised her forever on a starry night by Miller's Pond. The boy who had disappeared without a word. The air rushed out of her lungs in a silent gasp. The book she was holding slipped from her numb fingers, landing on the wooden floor with a soft, definitive thud. For Caleb, the meticulously constructed world he had built for himself shattered into a million pieces. The nameless, faceless obstacle from his blueprint had a name that screamed in the sudden silence of his mind: Nora. Her face was a map of a life he had abandoned, a little older, lines of worry and strength etched around her eyes, but it was her. The walls he had built around his heart didn't just crack, they disintegrated. They stood there, frozen, two ghosts meeting in the place where one of them was supposed to be a memory. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, with years of anger, and with the deafening sound of a shared past colliding with an impossible present. The silence was finally broken, not by either of them, but by a small, clear voice from the children's section. "Mommy, who's that man?" As if pulled by an invisible string, Caleb's gaze tore away from Nora's and fell upon the little girl standing by a colorful bookshelf. It was the child from across the street, but now, up close, he could see her properly. He saw her honey blonde hair, a chaotic halo around her small face. He saw her determined little chin. And then he saw her eyes. They were a perfect, startling reflection of his own. The world tilted on its axis. The floor beneath his polished Italian shoes seemed to drop away. He had come to buy a building, but he was staring at a life he never knew he'd left behind. The silence in the bookstore was no longer empty. It was a living, breathing thing, thick with the weight of 8 unspoken years. For a moment, the world consisted only of 3 people: a man whose empire had just turned to dust, a woman whose ghost had just walked through her door, and a little girl who was unknowingly the epicenter of it all. It was Nora who moved first. Her paralysis broke, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct that was as natural to her as breathing. She took a half step, subtly positioning herself so she was a shield between her daughter and the man who stood frozen by the entrance. The book lay forgotten at her feet. Her voice, when it came, was a wall of ice. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of recognition. It was the voice of a shopkeeper addressing a customer, a stranger. "Can I help you?" The simple question shattered the spell. Caleb flinched as if she'd struck him. He took a staggering step back, the heel of his expensive shoe scuffing against the worn wooden floor. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the gesture clumsy, unpracticed. The cool, decisive CEO was gone, replaced by a man completely and utterly lost. "Nora," he breathed, the name a pained whisper. She did not react. Her expression remained a cold, placid mask. "You must have me mistaken for someone else," she said, her tone level. "I'm Nora Callahan, the owner of this store." He tried to reboot, to access the corporate programming that had served him so well. Yes, of course," he stammered, his eyes flicking from her guarded face down to the little girl peeking out from behind her legs. "I'm Caleb Vance from Apex Development. I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Vance," Nora replied, and the formal address was a blade that twisted in his gut. "The whole town is. I assume you're here about the offer." She was giving him an out, a chance to retreat to the safety of business. He tried to take it, but his mind was a storm of impossible calculations. The girl's age is 7, he'd guessed. 8 years since he'd left. The math was a cruel, simple equation that his heart refused to solve. "Yes, the offer," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "We believe it's more than fair, and we—" He was cut off by the small, curious voice at Nora's knee. "Mommy," Lily whispered, her voice not shy, but analytical. "His eyes are like mine in the mirror." The innocent observation struck Caleb with the force of a lightning bolt. His gaze snapped back to the child. Now he was truly seeing her, not as a detail, but as a person. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head with an inquisitive frown. It was a faint, ghostly echo of the expressions he saw on his own face during late-night strategy sessions. It was in the way she stood, a small, defiant anchor in a world that was suddenly spinning out of control. It wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was a profound, unsettling familiarity that resonated deep in his bones. Nora's hand came to rest protectively on Lily's shoulder. She looked directly at Caleb, her eyes holding his, and for the first time he saw past the coldness to the raging fire beneath. It was the look of a mother protecting her cub. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping, each word precise and sharp. "My answer is the same today as it was in my final letter to your lawyers. The cozy corner is not for sale. Not now, not ever. Now, if you'll excuse us, my daughter and I were about to have our lunch." It was a dismissal, absolute and final. He opened his mouth to say something, what he didn't know, to argue, to plead, to ask the one terrifying question that was now screaming in his mind. But no words came. He was a titan of industry rendered speechless by a small-town bookseller and a 7-year-old girl. He simply nodded, a jerky, unfamiliar movement. He turned and walked out of the store, the cheerful tinkle of the bell mocking his retreat. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving him standing on the sun-drenched sidewalk, a stranger in his own past, utterly alone with the whisper of an impossible truth. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and fractured conversations for Caleb. He holed up in the town's only motel, the sterile, impersonal room a poor substitute for his glass tower in the city. He tried to focus on spreadsheets and revised offers, but every number, every decimal point, morphed into the image of a little girl's eyes. Eyes that were a perfect, startling reflection of his own. News of the CEO's visit and his confrontation at the cozy corner spread through Havenwood like wildfire. A town that had been slowly resigning itself to its fate now had a champion. Nora Callahan, the quiet bookseller, had become the unlikely leader of the resistance. And that resistance was about to find its voice. The town hall meeting was held on a stuffy Thursday evening in the high school gymnasium. The air was thick with the scent of old floor wax and anxious anticipation. Nearly every resident of Havenwood was there, their faces a sea of worry and defiance, all eyes fixed on the makeshift stage at the front. On one side sat Caleb, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers from the city, a picture of corporate power. On the other side was a simple wooden podium. After a tense introduction from the mayor, the floor was opened for public comment. For a moment, there was only the shuffling of feet and nervous coughs. Then, a figure stood up from the middle of the crowd. It was Nora. A quiet hush fell over the gymnasium as she walked to the podium. She wasn't dressed in the armor of a lawsuit or the confidence of a politician. She wore a simple cardigan and the quiet dignity of a mother fighting for her home. "My name is Nora Callahan," she began, her voice steady, though Caleb could see her hands trembling slightly on the lectern. "My family has owned a business on Main Street for 3 generations. It's not an asset on a balance sheet. It's a legacy. Mr. Vance and Apex Development have come here with promises of progress and prosperity. They show us beautiful drawings of a future that has no room for our past." She looked out at her neighbors, her friends. "They see property lines. We see the yards where our children learn to walk. They see buildings to be demolished. We see a lifetime of memories. They talk about creating jobs, but what about the lives they are proposing to erase?" Her gaze finally landed on Caleb, and the entire room felt the shift. Her words were for the town, but her eyes were aimed directly at his heart. "Some people believe that success means leaving a place like this behind," she said, her voice laced with a pain only he could understand. "They believe that building something new requires destroying what came before, but I believe there is strength in roots. There is value in staying, in building something that lasts, not just something that's profitable." The townspeople erupted in applause. Caleb sat rigid, his face an unreadable mask, but inside her words were a barrage of precisely aimed arrows. When the noise died down, he rose to his feet. He was the CEO again, his voice smooth and controlled. "Apex Development respects the heritage of Havenwood," he stated, the corporate jargon feeling like a foreign language on his tongue. "Our plan is one of economic revitalization. We are offering a future with opportunities that, frankly, do not exist here now. Opportunities for your children to thrive." Nora stepped forward, her voice cutting through his practiced speech. "What value does your company place on a child's sense of home, Mr. Vance? Can you quantify that? Can you put a price on the feeling of belonging?" The question was a direct challenge, deeply personal and impossible to answer with a number. "We are providing a chance for a better life," he countered, his composure fraying at the edges. "A chance to not be limited." He was talking about himself now, the boy who had felt so limited by this very town. "Maybe we don't feel limited," Nora shot back, her voice ringing with passion. "Maybe we feel grounded. Maybe the most valuable thing you can give a child isn't a chance to leave, but a reason to stay." The applause for Nora this time was deafening, a wave of solidarity that left Caleb standing alone on his side of the stage. The public debate was over. He had presented logic, she had presented soul, and in a place like Havenwood, soul always won. He and Nora locked eyes across the crowded room. In that moment, they were the only 2 people there. The lawyers, the mayor, the entire town faded away. He saw in her eyes an unbreakable strength and a deep, shimmering well of hurt. And she saw, for the first time, a flicker of something in his guarded expression that wasn't ambition or ruthlessness. It was the terrifying confusion of a man who was beginning to understand the true cost of the life he had chosen. He didn't wait for the crowd to disperse. He moved through the throngs of whispering townspeople, his focus singular, his path direct. He had to get to her. He had to understand. The polished certainty he'd worn for nearly a decade had been stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. He found her not in the gym, but outside in the cool night air, packing a box of flyers into the back of her old station wagon. She was alone, the yellow glow of the parking lot lights casting a weary halo around her. "That was quite a performance," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Nora didn't jump. She finished placing the box in her car before slowly turning to face him, her expression tired but defiant. "It wasn't a performance, Caleb. It was the truth. A concept you might find unfamiliar." The use of his first name, stripped of any formality, was a deliberate spark to a fuse. "The truth," he shot back, stepping closer. "The truth is you're standing in the way of progress. You're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment and the judgment of this entire town." "This isn't about sentimentality, and you know it," she retorted, her voice rising to meet his. "This is about you. This is what you do. You decide what you want, and you bulldoze everything in your path to get it. You did it 8 years ago, and you're doing it again now." "I left to build a life," he exclaimed, the words tearing from a place of long-buried pain. "Something better than this dead-end town could ever offer me. Something you said you understood." "I understood you had dreams," she fired back, her eyes flashing with the fire he'd seen in the gym. "I didn't understand that those dreams didn't include a single word of goodbye. Not a call. Not a letter. Nothing." The argument hung in the air, raw and painful. They weren't a CEO and a shop owner anymore. They were just Caleb and Nora, two hearts broken in the same place, standing in the ruins of their past. It was at that moment that a small, timid voice cut through the tension. "Mommy." They both froze. Lily stood in the doorway of the gymnasium, a small wooden box clutched in her hands, her face pale with worry from their raised voices. "Are you fighting?" Nora's anger instantly melted into concern. "No, sweet pea, we were just talking. Go back inside, I'll be right there." But Lily, startled by the strange man and the tension in the air, hurried towards her mother. As she ran, she stumbled on a crack in the pavement. The small wooden box flew from her grasp, tumbling through the air and landing with a clatter, its contents spilling across the dark asphalt. A collection of small treasures scattered. A smooth river stone, a dried wildflower, a silver locket, and a small, faded photograph. It landed face up, just inches from the toe of Caleb's shoe. The argument, the town, the $1 billion deal, it all vanished. Instinctively, Caleb bent down and picked up the small square of paper. The world seemed to stop spinning. It was a picture of him, or rather the boy he used to be. 18 years old, grinning a carefree, foolish grin, his hair a mess, standing by the edge of Miller's Pond. It was a picture Nora had taken one sunny afternoon, a lifetime ago. It was the face of the boy he had worked so hard to kill. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stared at the photograph, at the boy with the hopeful, stormy gray eyes. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze to Lily, who stood frozen, her own eyes wide with fear. He saw the boy in the photo. He saw the girl in the parking lot. The eyes, the exact same eyes. The pieces didn't just click into place, they slammed together with the force of a cosmic explosion. The resemblance he dismissed as coincidence. The unsettling familiarity. The math, 8 years since he'd left, and a 7-year-old girl standing before him. It wasn't a whisper of a possibility anymore. It was a screaming, undeniable certainty. Nora saw the realization dawn on his face. She saw his shock morph into a staggering, world-altering comprehension. The color drained from her own face, her defiance replaced by pure, naked terror. He rose to his feet slowly, the small photograph clutched in his trembling hand as if it were the most fragile, most valuable thing in the world. His corporate armor was gone. His anger had evaporated. All that remained was a man staring into the abyss of a life he never knew he had. He opened his mouth, but the only sound that came out was a broken, ragged whisper. "Nora, how old is she?" The question hung in the cold night air, a fragile, terrifying thing. For a moment, Nora didn't answer. Her first instinct, powerful and absolute, was to protect her child. She swiftly bent down, gathering a terrified Lily into her arms and pulling her close, shielding her from his shattered gaze. Lily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body trembling. "This isn't the place for this, Caleb," Nora said, her voice a low, warning hiss. "Go back to your hotel, go back to your life." But he couldn't move. The world had narrowed to this single, desperate point of truth. He took a step closer, the small, faded photograph still clutched in his white-knuckled hand. "Don't walk away from me, Nora. Not again. Just answer the question, please." The desperation in his voice, the raw pleading from a man she had only known as confident and controlled, was what broke her resolve. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. Her voice was barely audible, a confession torn from her soul. "She's 7, Nora whispered. "She'll be 8 in the spring." 7. The word hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, the number echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. 7 years of first steps, first words, bedtime stories, and scraped knees. 7 years of birthdays he'd never known. A whole lifetime had been lived without him, a lifetime he was supposed to be a part of. The shock curdled into a hot, blinding rage, at her, at himself, at the universe. 7 years, he repeated, his voice shaking with a fury born of profound loss. "And you never told me. You let me live my life not knowing I had a daughter. Why, Nora? Why would you keep her from me?" That was the spark that lit the fuse. 8 years of suppressed grief, of lonely nights, of quiet strength born from abandonment, erupted from Nora in a torrent of righteous fury. "Tell you," she cried, her voice cracking with disbelief and rage. "Tell who, Caleb, the ghost I was waiting for, the man who vanished without a trace? Where was I supposed to send the letter? To what address? You want to know why I didn't tell you?" She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing. "Because I was alone. I found out I was pregnant 2 months after you disappeared. I called the number you gave me 100 times until it was disconnected. I had nothing. No note, no explanation, just gone." The words poured out of her, a dam of pain breaking wide open. "I went through every single day of that pregnancy by myself. I held my own hand in the delivery room. I worked 2 jobs with a baby at home so she would have food to eat and a roof over her head. I was there for the fevers in the middle of the night, for the nightmares, for the first day of school. I was the one who had to answer the question, 'Mommy, where's my daddy? Where were you, Caleb? Where were you when your daughter needed you?'" He stood there, reeling from the onslaught, every word a fresh wound. "I didn't know," he choked out, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "If I had known, I would have. Would have what?" She cut him off, her voice dripping with scorn. "Sent a check, flown in for a weekend, handled it like another one of your business problems. She is not a problem to be solved. She is a person. She is my daughter, mine." The final word was a declaration of ownership, of a bond forged in fire and sacrifice, a bond he had no part in. "You gave up every right to her the day you decided your ambition was more important than your promises," she said, her voice now dropping to a chilling, resolute whisper. "You don't get to come back 8 years later and claim a title you never earned. You have no right." The sight of Lily, now openly crying in her arms, finally broke through Caleb's storm of emotion. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He looked at the crying child, his daughter, and the truth of Nora's words crushed him. He had no rights here. He was a stranger. Nora saw the fight leave his eyes. With a final, heartbreaking look of resolve, she turned her back on him. She carried Lily to the car, buckled her into her seat, and got behind the wheel without a single backward glance. The old station wagon started with a sputter, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the parking lot. It pulled away, leaving Caleb standing alone. The faded photograph of the boy he once was still in his hand, and the devastating truth of the man he had become weighing more heavily than his entire empire. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Time had lost all meaning. The world he had so meticulously constructed, a world of profit margins, stock prices, and calculated risks, had been obliterated by a 7-year-old girl with his eyes. The truth, once known, cannot be unknown. It settles into your bones, a new and permanent weight. He eventually made his way back to his car, the leather interior feeling less like a luxury and more like a cage. He drove back to the sterile motel room, the engine of his powerful car a low, mournful hum. Every landmark of Havenwood that he passed, the old oak tree, the town square, the faded sign for Miller's Pond, was no longer just a ghost of his own past. Now, it was a part of a life his daughter was living, a life he had no part in. Back in his room, he tossed his keys onto the cheap dresser and collapsed onto the edge of the bed, the faded photograph still in his hand. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, whose single word could move markets. Yet in this small, insignificant room, he felt utterly powerless. He was a king without a kingdom, a father without a name. His solitude was shattered by the insistent, vibrating buzz of his phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a single name, Sterling. For the first time in his professional life, Caleb considered ignoring the call, but instinct, honed over a decade of corporate warfare, took over. He answered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Yes, I've been trying to reach you for an hour, Caleb." Sterling's voice was sharp, all traces of mentorship replaced by the impatience of a chairman. "The board has been reviewing the reports from the town hall meeting. They are displeased. What in God's name is going on down there?" Caleb stared at the floral pattern on the cheap motel carpet, his mind a million miles away. "There are complications." "Complications?" Sterling scoffed. "The only complication is one woman in one bookstore who is making a fool of our entire legal department. The board is losing faith, Caleb. They're talking about pulling you from the project." Caleb felt a flicker of his old, defensive anger. "They can't do that." "Oh, yes, they can," Sterling countered, his voice like ice. "And they will, unless you handle this immediately. The final offer has been rejected. The time for the personal touch is over. We are moving to the next phase." Caleb's blood ran cold. He knew what the next phase was. "Sterling, don't. It's out of my hands now, son. If you can't close the deal by the end of the week, the board has authorized the litigation team to take over. And you know how they operate. It's scorched earth. They'll bury her in injunctions, lawsuits, and eminent domain filings. They will bleed her dry until she has no choice but to crawl away with nothing. The bookstore will be ours one way or another." The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. It wasn't about buying the bookstore anymore. It was about destroying it, about destroying her. "Give me more time," Caleb said, his voice strained. "Time is the one thing you don't have," Sterling replied, his tone final. "Fix this, Caleb, or we will." The line went dead. Caleb lowered the phone, his hand trembling. He was trapped. His career, the empire he had sacrificed everything for, was a train moving at full speed. And the family he never knew he had, Nora and his daughter, his Lily, was standing directly on the tracks. If he did nothing, the train would run them over, and he would be the one who failed to stop it. If he stood in its way, it would destroy him. He walked to the window and looked out at the quiet, sleeping town. He could just make out the dark silhouette of Main Street. He saw the faint light in the apartment above the cozy corner, a tiny beacon in the vast darkness. Nora was in there. His daughter was in there. Safe for now. He had come to Havenwood to tear down a memory. Now he had to find a way to save it, even if it meant tearing down his own future. In a city, you can be anonymous, a single face lost in a river of millions. But in a place like Havenwood, a secret is just a story that hasn't found the right front porch yet. And the story of the town hall meeting, of the fiery confrontation between the quiet bookseller and the prodigal CEO, became the only story that mattered. The morning after their argument, the air in town was different. It was charged with speculation. At the diner, over plates of pancakes and steaming coffee, the whispers were relentless. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" Marge, the diner owner, said as she refilled Mr. Henderson's cup. "That wasn't business." "Bad blood there," Mr. Henderson agreed, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Goes way back, I'd wager. He didn't just leave a town behind. He left something else." For Nora, the change was palpable. The cozy corner, once her sanctuary, now felt like a glass house. People would come in ostensibly to browse, but she could feel their curious eyes on her. They'd buy a book and linger at the counter, hoping she might offer some small piece of the puzzle. The town that had championed her now watched her, their support mingled with an insatiable curiosity. She felt less like a hero and more like a specimen under a microscope. She tried to ignore it for Lily's sake. She maintained their routine, a walk to the park after the store closed, story time before bed, with a forced cheerfulness that felt heavier each day. But children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for. They don't always understand the words, but they are experts in the quiet language of a heavy heart. Lily had grown quiet. She would sit in her reading nook, her gaze distant, her small brow furrowed in thought. Nora knew the questions were coming. She dreaded them with every fiber of her being. The dam finally broke one evening. Rain pattered softly against the windows of their small apartment above the bookstore. Nora was tucking Lily into bed, the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminating the pages of a well-loved fairy tale. "Mommy?" Lily's voice was small in the quiet room. Yes, sweet pea, Nora answered, not looking up from the book. That man, Mr. Vance, Lily began, her fingers tracing the outline of a dragon on the page. Is he the reason you look sad? Nora's heart constricted. She slowly closed the book, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. She looked at her daughter, at her bright, searching eyes, his eyes, and saw a worry there that no 7-year-old should have to carry. Oh, honey, no, Mommy's not sad, just a little tired. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. Lily was silent for a moment, then she asked the question that Nora had been dreading most of all. It was a question born of pure, childish observation, and it was more devastating than any corporate threat. Why does he look at me like that? She whispered. When he was in the parking lot, he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Nora's breath caught in her throat. How do you explain to a child that she is, in a way, the ghost of a love that died long ago? How do you protect her from a truth that is now an unstoppable force, a truth that had a name and was staying at the motel down the street? She pulled the covers up to Lily's chin, her movements slow and deliberate. She kissed her daughter's forehead, lingering for a moment, trying to absorb some of her innocence, to shield her from the complexity of it all. He's just someone I used to know a long time ago, Nora whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. And sometimes, when grown-ups see each other after a long time, it can bring up a lot of complicated feelings. It has nothing to do with you, my love. Nothing at all. Lily seemed to accept the answer, her eyelids growing heavy. Soon, her breathing evened out into the soft rhythm of sleep, but Nora sat there in the dim light long after, her hand resting on her sleeping child. The whispers of the town were a nuisance she could endure. She could stand against a billion-dollar company, and the man who ran it, but she didn't know how to stand against her own daughter's simple, heartbreaking questions. For Caleb, the days following the confrontation were a special kind of hell. He was a man defined by action, a problem solver who thrived on complex strategies and decisive moves. But here, he was paralyzed. The threat from Sterling and the board was a ticking clock, a promise of scorched earth that was aimed directly at the woman and child he now felt a desperate, primal need to protect. Yet, how could he protect them from a fire he himself had started? And beneath the corporate crisis was the deeper, more personal agony. He was a father. The word was foreign, an ill-fitting suit he didn't know how to wear. He knew nothing about the little girl who carried his eyes. For a man who could navigate the treacherous currents of international finance, the simple heart of a 7-year-old girl was a terrifying, uncharted territory. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He tried to solve the problem with money. It started the next morning. A large, gleaming white delivery truck, a brand of a high-end New York toy store, rumbled down Havenwood's quiet Main Street. It was as out of place as a spaceship. It parked directly in front of the cozy corner, its presence drawing curious neighbors to their windows. Nora was inside, helping Lily sound out the words in a new book, when 2 men in crisp uniforms walked in. "Delivery for Miss Lily Callahan," one of them announced. Before Nora could protest, they began unloading. Box after giant box filled the small, sacred space of her bookstore. A dollhouse the size of a small car, an easel with a dizzying array of paints. A state-of-the-art tablet. A mountain of pink, plastic, and battery-operated noise. It wasn't a gift, it was an invasion, an occupation. Nora's face hardened. She saw this for what it was, a hostile takeover of her daughter's affections. It was Caleb bypassing her, using the one weapon he had always trusted to get what he wanted. "Take it back," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. The delivery man looked confused. "Ma'am, it's all been paid for." "I don't care," Nora said, her voice rising. "Take it all back, we don't want it." Later that afternoon, Caleb made his way to the bookstore. He'd been hoping, foolishly, that the gifts might have bought him a sliver of goodwill, a small opening. Instead, he found Nora on the sidewalk, standing beside a pile of rejected presents. She looked like a queen guarding her castle from a vulgar tribute. When she saw him, her eyes blazed with a cold fire. "What is this, Caleb?" she demanded, gesturing to the mountain of toys. "What do you think you're doing?" He felt a surge of defensive frustration. I thought she would like them. I'm trying, Nora." "No," she shot back, taking a step toward him. "You are not trying, you are buying. It is the only thing you have ever known how to do. You think you can show up here with a truck full of plastic and erase 7 years of silence. She is not one of your corporate assets that you can acquire with a generous offer. That's not what I was, isn't it?" she interrupted, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "You don't know the first thing about her. You don't know that she prefers drawing with chalk on the sidewalk to any expensive paint set. You don't know that her favorite toy is a worn-out stuffed bear named Patches. You don't know that she's scared of thunderstorms, or the name of her imaginary friend, or the sound of her laugh when she reads a really funny book." Each word was a perfectly aimed blow, stripping away his defenses. "You can't buy that knowledge, Caleb," she finished, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You don't get to skip the last 7 years and just purchase the finish line. That is not how fatherhood works." She looked at him, her message clear and absolute. The wall between them, which had momentarily cracked, was now rebuilt, higher and thicker than ever before. She turned without another word, walked back into her store, and locked the door behind her. Caleb was left standing alone on the sidewalk, surrounded by the bright, garish symbols of his failure. He was a man who could buy anything in the world, except the one thing he now realized he desperately wanted: a way back in. He spent the rest of the day in his motel room, the rejected gifts from the sidewalk having been unceremoniously returned to his doorstep by a sympathetic but firm Mr. Henderson. The silence in the room was a roaring accusation. Every strategy he devised, every path forward he considered, led to a dead end. His corporate power was a weapon he couldn't use without hurting the very people he now sought to protect. His personal touch was a clumsy, insulting failure. He was trapped in a stalemate of his own making. As afternoon bled into evening, the sky outside the motel window began to change. The bright, clear blue bruised to a deep, ominous purple. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the cheap window frame. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, a storm that felt less like weather and more like a reflection of the tempest in his own soul. Inside the cozy corner, Nora welcomed the change. A rainy day was a good day for a bookstore. She and Lily were curled up in the children's section, the sound of the first fat drops of rain pattering against the roof a cozy, comforting rhythm. For the first time in days, a fragile peace settled over Nora. Here, surrounded by her books and her daughter, she felt safe. The first sign of trouble was small, a single dark spot that bloomed on the cover of an old leather-bound copy of Moby Dick sitting on a high shelf. Nora frowned, reaching up to touch it. It was damp. She looked up at the ceiling. Another drop fell, landing on her hand. Cold, insistent. Drip. She quickly moved the book, placing a small wastebasket on the shelf to catch the water. It was an old building. A small leak during a heavy storm wasn't unheard of. But then she heard it again from another corner of the store. Drip. Drip. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her calm. She rushed toward the sound and found a steady trickle of water weaving its way down the wall, pooling on a stack of classic novels. The sound was no longer cozy, it was a violation. The rain outside wasn't falling anymore, it was attacking, a relentless assault against her aging, vulnerable roof. Drip, 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 drip. The sound was everywhere now, a cruel, steady metronome marking the destruction of her world. She and Lily scrambled, grabbing every bucket, pot, and pan they could find from the apartment upstairs. But for every leak they caught, 2 more seemed to appear. Water was seeping into brittle, century-old paper, blurring ink that had told stories for generations. These weren't just inventory. They were survivors, treasures, the collected soul of her family's legacy. And they were being destroyed. Sobbing now, her clothes soaked and her hair plastered to her face, Nora frantically called the only emergency roofer in town. A gruff voice on the other end told her what she already knew in her heart. No one could get up on a roof in a storm like this. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after. The price he quoted was a number so impossibly large, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was money she didn't have. Money she would never have. Defeated, she slid down the wall, sinking to the floor amidst the chaotic orchestra of dripping water. She pulled a terrified, crying Lily into her lap, hugging her tight. All her strength, all her defiance against the corporate giant and the ghost from her past, felt meaningless now. She was being beaten not by a man, but by the simple, merciless physics of rain and gravity. It was a crisis she could not fight, a disaster she could not afford, a battle she was utterly, devastatingly alone in, and she was losing. From the window of his motel room, Caleb watched the storm rage. He could see the lights of the apartment above the cozy corner flickering against the violent downpour. He pictured Nora and Lily inside, alone, surrounded by the sound of the deluge. He imagined their fear. The feeling of his own powerlessness was a bitter, suffocating poison. What good was a billion-dollar empire in the face of a leaky roof? He paced the small room, a caged tiger, the threats from Sterling echoing in his mind. He was supposed to be the predator, the one who applied pressure until his target broke. But the thought of Nora, broken and defeated, not by him, but by a simple storm, was unbearable. And in that moment of utter frustration, a memory surfaced. A ghost from a life he thought he'd buried. The memory of his grandfather's workshop, the smell of sawdust and varnish, the feel of a hammer in his hand, the quiet satisfaction of mending something broken. Power, he was slowly realizing, wasn't just about what you could command others to do. Sometimes, true power was about what you could do with your own two hands when everything else was stripped away. He didn't call. He didn't text. He simply acted. An hour later, a loud, insistent knock echoed on the bookstore's back door, cutting through the chaotic symphony of the storm. Nora, startled, cautiously opened it a crack. It was Caleb, but it was not the CEO. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by soaked jeans and a dark rain jacket. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and in his hands he held not a contract but a heavy-duty tarp and a toolbox. "What are you doing here?" Nora demanded, her voice tight with suspicion, ready for another fight. Caleb didn't argue. He didn't try to explain. He just met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the storm. "The roof," he said, his voice low and steady over the roar of the wind. "I'm here to stop the leak." Before she could protest, he was moving. He found the old wooden ladder behind the store, a ladder he remembered from his youth, and propped it against the slick brick wall. Nora watched, stunned into silence, as the billionaire CEO climbed onto her treacherous, rain-slicked roof in the dead of night. She stood at the window for what felt like hours, watching the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. She heard the scrape of his boots above her, the heavy snap of the tarp as he fought the wind, the rhythmic, determined sound of a hammer driving nails into shingles. Each thud was a counterpoint to the relentless dripping inside. His hands, she thought, the hands she'd seen gripping a whiskey glass or the sleek glass of a smartphone, were the same hands that were now battling a storm for her. They were becoming the hands she remembered, the hands of a carpenter's grandson, strong and capable. The hands that had once fixed her porch swing and built her a bookshelf. The man on her roof wasn't Mr. Vance, the corporate raider who saw her home as a red dot on a map. He was just Caleb, a boy from Havenwood who knew how to fix broken things. Sometime after midnight, compelled by an instinct she didn't understand, she brewed a pot of coffee. She opened the back door and called his name into the wind. He climbed down, drenched and shivering, his face streaked with grime. He looked exhausted, but more real than she had seen him in years. She handed him a steaming mug. He took it, his cold fingers brushing against hers. It was the first time they had touched in 8 years. "Be careful up there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will," he answered. It was a truce offered in a ceramic mug. The anger between them had been washed away by the rain, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. He worked through the rest of the night. As the first pale, gray light of dawn broke on the horizon, the storm finally subsided. He climbed down the ladder one last time as a weary sun peeked through the clouds. He had managed to secure the tarp over the worst of the damage. The relentless dripping inside had slowed to a few final drops. He stood before her, soaked and spent, not a hero or a villain, just a man who had shown up. In his tired eyes, she saw no trace of the ruthless CEO. She only saw the boy she once loved, and she felt the cold, impenetrable wall she had built around her heart begin, for the very first time, to melt. He didn't stay for breakfast. He didn't wait for thanks. With a quiet nod that felt more meaningful than any conversation they'd had, Caleb collected his tools and walked back to his motel in the pale morning light. The anger and the tension of the past week had been washed away, not just by the rain, but by the simple, honest exhaustion of physical labor. Back in the sterile quiet of his room, he peeled off his soaked, grimy clothes and stood under a stream of hot water, letting it sluice the mud and fatigue from his body. But it couldn't wash away the clarity that had settled in his mind. He had spent a decade building an empire of abstractions, of stock prices, of market shares, of futures and acquisitions. It was a world of numbers on a screen. But in one night, the simple, solid reality of a leaking roof, of splintered wood and a child's frightened eyes had reminded him of what was real. He looked at his hands. They were raw, red, and scraped. A small cut graced his right knuckle. These were not the hands of a CEO, accustomed to the smooth glass of a smartphone and the weight of a Montblanc pen. They were the hands of his grandfather, the hands of a carpenter, the hands of the boy from Havenwood he had tried so hard to erase. His suit, his armor, hung in the closet, looking like a costume for a part he no longer wanted to play. On the nightstand, next to the silent, menacing phone, lay the faded photograph of his younger self. He picked it up. For the first time, he didn't see the boy he had run from. He saw the boy who knew the value of things that couldn't be bought. He knew what he had to do. The path forward was no longer a complicated negotiation. It was a simple, terrifying choice. With a deep, steadying breath, he sat on the edge of the bed and picked up his phone. He scrolled past a dozen missed calls and urgent texts from his legal team and dialed the one number that mattered. Sterling answered on the first ring. "Caleb, finally, tell me you have good news. Has the legal team been authorized to move in?" His voice was crisp, impatient, the voice of a man expecting a report from the battlefield. Caleb looked out the window at the now clean, rain-washed town. He could see the roof of the cozy corner, dark and patched with the new tarp. "The legal team will stand down," he said, his voice quiet but infused with a calm authority Sterling had never heard before. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "What did you say?" "The board has already approved the action. It's out of your hands." "No," Caleb replied simply. "It's not. I'm invoking my authority as lead project manager and the majority stakeholder in this initiative. I am officially suspending all acquisition activities related to the Havenwood project, effective immediately." Sterling's voice exploded through the phone. "Have you lost your mind? Do you know what you're doing? The board will have your head for this. They'll push you out. This project is your legacy, Caleb. It's everything you've worked for." Caleb's gaze drifted from the bookstore to the small town square, where a few children were now playing in the puddles left by the storm. He saw a flash of honey-blonde hair that made his heart ache. "You were right, Sterling," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "This project is about my legacy." He took a breath, a new definition of the word forming in his mind. "I'm just starting to understand what that really means." Without waiting for a reply, he ended the call. He tossed the phone onto the bed, severing the connection to the world he had built. A profound sense of peace settled over him. He had just risked his entire empire, his career, his future. He had likely made an enemy of the most powerful people he knew. But for the first time in 8 years, he felt like he was finally building something that might actually last. Word of a second town hall meeting spread through Havenwood not with a whisper, but with a shudder of dread. This time, there was no hope of resistance, no fire of defiance. There was only a heavy sense of resignation. The giant had been provoked, and now it was coming to deliver the final, crushing blow. That evening, the high school gymnasium was once again filled to capacity, but the mood was funereal. The townspeople sat in grim silence, a congregation waiting for a verdict they already knew. Nora was there, sitting in the back with Lily beside her. She hadn't come to fight. She had come to bear witness to the end, to show her daughter what it meant to face a loss with dignity. She held Lily's hand, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. When Caleb walked in, a ripple of confusion went through the crowd. He wasn't flanked by his lawyers. He wasn't wearing the sharp, intimidating suit of a corporate conqueror. He was alone, dressed in a simple dark sweater and slacks. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had come to pay his respects. He walked to the podium and stood for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the sea of anxious, weary faces until it found Nora's in the back of the room. He held her eyes for a heartbeat, a silent, unreadable message passing between them. "Good evening," he began, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual corporate authority. It was just the voice of a man. "I know why you're all here. You're expecting a final ultimatum. You're expecting me to talk about contracts, about legal actions, about the inevitable." The crowd tensed. Nora squeezed Lily's hand tighter. "I came back to Havenwood with a blueprint," Caleb continued, his eyes leaving Nora's to look at the whole town. "A plan I was very proud of. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was empty. I saw assets to be acquired and property lines to be redrawn. I saw the future, but I failed to see the people living in the present. He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle in the silent room. I was wrong. A stunned murmur rippled through the gymnasium. A legacy isn't measured in the height of the buildings you erect, he said, his voice gaining a strength born not of power, but of conviction. It's measured in the strength of the foundations you choose to preserve, and the foundation of this town is its community, its history, its heart. Therefore, he announced, his voice ringing with clarity, effective immediately, Apex Development is officially and permanently withdrawing its proposal to build a resort in Havenwood. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. The town held its collective breath, unable to process what they had just heard. Then a single person began to clap, followed by another, and another, until the entire gymnasium erupted in a thunderous, disbelieving, joyous wave of applause and cheers. Caleb held up a hand, a gentle smile touching his lips for the first time. "But I'm not leaving," he said, and the room grew quiet again, listening. "Instead, I am announcing the formation of the Havenwood Preservation Initiative, a new fund, personally backed by me, dedicated to investing in and revitalizing Main Street, not by tearing it down, but by building it up." He talked of new grants for small businesses, of restoring the old movie theater, of creating a town that their children would be proud to call home. And then, his voice softened, and his gaze found its way back to the corner of the room where a woman was silently weeping. "The initiative's first project," he said, his voice thick with an emotion the entire town could feel, "will be a full, no-strings-attached grant for the complete restoration and a lifetime endowment of the business that represents the true heart of this community, the cozy corner bookstore." He was looking directly at them now, at Nora, whose face was awash with tears of shock and disbelief, and at Lily, who was looking up at her mother, then back at the man on the stage, a slow, curious smile spreading across her face. In that moment, he wasn't a CEO making a business announcement. He was a man making a public promise. It was an apology, a declaration, and a plea all delivered in a single, selfless act. He was showing her and the whole world that he had finally learned what it meant to build something real. The applause returned, louder this time, filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost tangible. But Caleb barely heard it. He only saw Nora, and in her tear-filled eyes, he saw the faint, shimmering hope of a new beginning. The gymnasium erupted into a chaotic, joyous celebration. People were hugging, laughing, and crying with relief. A crowd immediately swarmed Caleb, not with the anger of a mob, but with the overwhelming gratitude of a town that had just been given a second chance. They shook his hand, clapped him on the back, their former villain now an unlikely savior. Through the sea of jubilant faces, Caleb's eyes searched for only one. He saw Nora standing near the back, holding Lily's hand, looking overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. He excused himself, navigating his way through the well-wishers, his path feeling like the most important journey of his life. As he approached, the townspeople seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, instinctively parting to give them space. The noise of the celebration faded into a respectful hum. He stopped a few feet from her, the vast, echoing space of the gymnasium suddenly feeling as intimate as a confessional. "Nora," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former power, left with only its raw humanity. "You were right about everything." He took a small, hesitant step closer. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that. A man can't undo 8 years of silence with a single speech. It might take a lifetime to even begin to earn your forgiveness." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor before rising to meet hers again, full of a vulnerability she had never seen. "I'm here to ask for something much smaller and much harder. I'm here to ask for a beginning. Let me be a part of her life. Let me show you, not tell you, but show you day by day that I can be the man you both deserve." His eyes then shifted to the small girl standing beside her mother. He knelt, bringing himself down to her level, so he was no longer a towering figure, but just a man. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "My name is Caleb. I'd really like to get to know you, if that's okay with your mom." Lily looked from Caleb's earnest face to her mother's. Nora looked down at her daughter, and then back at the man who had just dismantled his own world for them. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but for the first time it was not a tear of sorrow or anger. It was a tear of fragile, uncertain hope. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay, Caleb," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 emotions. "We can start there. A beginning. A beginning is not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, patient process. It was not a grand gesture, but a series of small, ordinary moments that followed. The seasons in Havenwood turned. Autumn painted the mountains in fiery colors, and winter blanketed them in a soft, healing silence. Caleb stayed. He didn't just write a check for the bookstore's restoration. He was there, talking to the contractors, learning the difference between oak and pine. He didn't just set up a fund. He met with the other business owners, listening to their ideas, offering his expertise not as a CEO, but as a neighbor. More importantly, he learned about his daughter. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of the sky just before nightfall. He learned that she was scared of spiders, but not of thunderstorms. He learned the name of her imaginary friend was a squirrel named Sir Reginald. He didn't buy this knowledge. He earned it, one homework session, one school play, and one shared ice cream cone at a time. Spring arrived, and with it, the grand reopening of the cozy corner. The bookstore was beautiful, restored to its former glory but with a new, brighter warmth. The roof no longer leaked, the lights no longer flickered, and the shelves were full of new stories waiting to be discovered. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, the sunlight streamed through the large front window, just as it always had. In the newly cushioned reading nook, 3 people were curled up in the big armchair. Lily sat nestled between them, her head leaning against her mother's shoulder, her feet resting in her father's lap. They were reading a book aloud, taking turns with the different voices. Nora's was warm and gentle, Caleb's was a surprisingly good, gravelly impression of a dragon, and Lily's was high and full of excitement. Their quiet laughter filled the bookstore, a sound more valuable than any asset Caleb had ever owned. A legacy, Caleb had finally learned, wasn't a building or a bank account. It was a story. And in a quiet corner of a small town called Havenwood, the 3 of them had finally started writing theirs together. And so our story, Where Love Begins Again, comes to its final page. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey, for following the story of Nora, Caleb, and Lily. It's a reminder that sometimes our greatest legacy isn't what we build for the world, but the bridges we build to find our way back home and back to each other. From all of us here at The Story Weaver, we want to extend our deepest thanks for your time and your wonderful support. We wish you all good health, and we wish you and your family a lifetime of happiness, filled with your own beautiful stories. Until our next chapter begins, take care.